Hello and welcome to today's webinar on emerging risks. My name is Holly and I'm part of the professional development team here at IIRSM. Your speaker today is IIRSM member and CEO of Satarla Risk Management, Dr. Sarah Gordon. Before I hand over to Sarah, there are just a couple of things to run through first. So to begin with, you'll be on mute for the duration of the webinar. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask these using the Q&A chat function on the bottom right corner of your screen. We'll address any questions that you may have at the end. And secondly, this webinar is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be placed on the IIRSM YouTube channel and the Satarla website after the event. Okay, that's enough from me. Sarah, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Holly. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with everybody here this morning. So thank you very much for dialing in. As Holly has mentioned, today we are going to explore the wonderful world of emerging risks and what that means. As Holly mentioned, this recording will be made available on the IIRSM website later. And it will also be made available on the Satarla website, where if you go to now, you will already be able to find all of the slides and materials that I'm going to be going through over the next half an hour. And I'm sure that we can post that link in the chat for you so you guys can go and find that straight away. So with regards to our agenda and what we're going to go through today, I'm going to start off by exploring what do we actually mean by emerging risk, and then go into, so how do we manage it? Because that's the whole purpose of risk management, is to take control of our risks where possible, not just to sit back and watch them develop. We're then going to take a little look at risk tolerance, and that will lead us into trigger action response plans, which will finally lead us into how do we deal with risks when they are evolving on a very rapid basis, i.e. live risk management. Just by way of background, so you can hopefully see from the video and my picture, we look pretty much alike. So that's me. My name's Dr. Sarah Gordon. And as Holly mentioned, I'm a member of the IIRSM, and I also run a risk management consultancy called Satarla. By background, I'm originally a geologist. So yes, I spend a lot of my time flying around the world when things are usual, going and exploring different mining companies, but also various different heavy industry organizations as well. Within Satarla, we also get to work with all kinds of different organizations, from charities to banks to agriculture, life sciences, as well as working with government as well. So if you want to find out a bit more about us, again, please go to our website, and it's of course got lots of details there. So without further ado, what do we actually mean by emerging risk? Well, to start with, what is risk? And just to align all of us, because I know that there are many different definitions for risk and risk management out there in the wider world. But using one of our favorite ones that, of course, we use here in the UK, risk can be defined as the effect of uncertainty on our objectives. And of course, this comes from ISO 31000. And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean that we want to take charge of some of that uncertainty that may push things that could happen to us or could happen to impact on our objectives in a positive or a negative direction. Now, of course, as we go through time, or perhaps as we go through change, the uncertainty degree that we're looking at can get greater, and often does get greater. And this means that those potential opportunities or threats get less certain as we progress further away from our present moment in time or what we currently understand. And of course, what we want to do is to understand what might be those potential pros or cons or opportunities or threats that can impact on whatever it is that we might be doing, and take charge of them and be able to map them as a whole, because by being able to understand the full value of those potential opportunities or threats, it's through that we can understand to a greater degree what is the true value for actually managing our risks. So that's about risk. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on our objectives. And of course, those effects can either be positive or negative. We're talking about balancing out those pros and those cons. But risk management is about doing something about your risks. Risk management is not doing a risk assessment. Risk management is about taking action and doing something about that degree of uncertainty. And if we're looking at a threat, we're trying to decrease the chances of that threat occurring. And if we're looking at an opportunity, we're trying to increase the chances of that opportunity occurring. And if we take all of those different processes from around the world and we boil them down and we say, okay, what do they all have in common with regards to how do we manage risks? We can boil them down to 4 very simple steps. Step number 1, understand what is the context in which we're trying to operate, be it the internal as well as the external context, and what are we actually trying to achieve? So what are our objectives? Step number 2, within that, what are the risks that we are actually trying to do something about? So we want to identify them, we want to understand them, and we also want to say, well, so what? Are there any risks in that array that we actually need to do something about, or can we do something about? So that's your risk assessment. Then into step number 3, and this is where we take charge, or we take control of those risks, and we actively manage those risks, thereby taking control of the uncertainty round about those risks. And then into step number 4, are monitoring, reviewing, reporting, and communication. And it's in here that we ascertain if any of this action that we're taking is being effective and guiding those risks in the direction in which we want them to move. And that takes us back up to the top of our process again, so back into that context and objectives. And this circular process, which of course is very, very similar to plan, do, check, act, and this aligns wholeheartedly with all of those other risk management processes that we have around the world, enables us to ask the question, given the context in which we're operating and the objectives that we're trying to achieve, and those potential opportunities or threats that we face in order to do that, and our ability to manage them, is it actually possible to achieve those objectives? If the answer is yes, then great, carry on. If the answer is no, then we have 2 options. We've got 2 levers that we can pull. Lever number 1 is we can pump more time, money, effort into managing those risks. Or option number 2, if we can't do anything more on the management side, is to consider changing those objectives, because otherwise we're trying to achieve something that is just impossible. And so this circular process, which of course is iterative, it's never perfect, it's always changing, allows us to challenge what is it our organizations are trying to do, given that constantly evolving context in which we are trying to operate. And this is really important because this takes us into the world of emerging risk, because emerging risk is something that has huge amounts of uncertainty associated with it. An emerging risk is just a risk that we really don't know very much about. And it might be because it's something that may happen in the far distant future, or it might be something where the context round about it is changing so rapidly, there's just a huge amount of stuff that we don't know about it. Now, as you can see here on this slide, there are a number of different definitions that are being used. However, the one that you can see here is the working definition that is being used by the new ISO standard that is being drafted for emerging risk. So ISO 31050, which we anticipate may be launched in 2021, but of course there is a question mark there. This is an ISO standard that will fit nicely into ISO 31000 that will talk explicitly about emerging risks. So those risks that have a huge amount of uncertainty associated with them. Now, usually emerging risks are those risks that are those high impact, low likelihood risks. Okay, so that's where you may position them in an impact against likelihood grid. Or they're sometimes called those long tail risks. So the ones that are on the very edge of that distribution curve. So depending on your background and what kind of industry sector you work in, and whether you like to use impact against likelihood or whether you like to do value at risk calculations, it doesn't matter. Emerging risks still appear in all of those different ways of assessing and prioritizing our risks. The problem is that they're often considered to be those risks that are just too hard, or they're ones that we really don't want to face up to, because despite the fact that they might have a massive impact, the fact that the likelihood of them occurring is so low, or so difficult to put your finger on, or so difficult to ascertain, means that balancing up the cost of putting in place those controls to actually manage them versus that risk actually happening can be quite difficult for an organization to justify in terms of spending all of that money, time, and effort in terms of managing. Now, this is something which has always been a problem for risk management, because actually some of the biggest risks that we face as organizations or as governments or as human beings sit in that high impact, low likelihood box on that particular grid. A global pandemic, for example, I suspect for most of us around the world sat in that box. And we're now all seeing the impacts of what happens when a global pandemic really takes hold, especially when we haven't been prepared for it. Similarly, many natural hazards, such as a large earthquake in the state of California in the US, that may well sit in the same box. And the problem with that is, from a geological standpoint, we know that there will be a very, very large earthquake in California at some point in time. We just don't know when. It will happen, and it will be incredibly destructive. We just don't know when it will occur. And so therefore, it is very, very difficult to plan and to work out, okay, how much effort should we put into actually trying to manage this before that event truly occurs. Now, with regards to emerging risks and trying to predict the future and trying to look at those long tail risks, for example, you can't give a presentation without mentioning a certain gentleman, Mr. Taleb, because of course he wrote a book called The Black Swan, and together with many others, that really give us a lot of food for thought around what is it that we should be doing when we're trying to identify and then work out how we're going to manage those risks that could be high impact but of a very low likelihood of occurring anytime soon, or huge uncertainty with regards to when they might occur. So likelihood and uncertainty are, of course, different in this context. So Taleb talks a lot about these in his books. And one of the things that he especially mentions, especially when we get towards the anti-fragility or perhaps the resilience side of things, is to say that no risk occurs in isolation. Everything is interconnected. And this different way of looking at risks, because of course the traditional way of looking at risks is to spend a lot of time putting your finger on what is the real risk, and then perhaps doing a risk bow tie or something like that round about the edge of that bow tie. That has its place and it's incredibly valuable. But unless we look at risks in their network structure or in a series of different scenarios, then it often means that we've misunderstood some of what may actually occur in the real world. So no risk occurs in isolation. Everything is interconnected, and there are almost a never-ending array of possibilities with regards to what may or may not occur in the future. And that takes us in to this concept of known knowns and known unknowns. Now, I'm sure many of you have used this in the past, especially when trying to teach people about, okay, what might a black swan truly be? And if we look at this, we can say that in that top right-hand corner, we have our known knowns, and these are often called facts. This is where our issues, our events, or our incidents sit. So this is where the stuff that we know everything about, usually it's happened, sits. So we've got lots of information about those facts. We can then move down into our known unknowns, and it's in this box that we often put our acknowledged risks. Now, we're not necessarily managing them, but we know quite a lot about them, and we are talking about them. So these are the risks that we will often find on our risk registers. We can then go into our unknown unknowns or our unknown not knowns. And for the purposes of this exercise, often these are referred to as being our true surprises, or those black swan events that, to be honest, we just did not see coming in their full entirety. The reason why they're called black swans is because for most of us based here in Europe, we all think that swans are white. But of course, a few hundred years ago, some intrepid explorers got on a boat and went all the way to Western Australia, where, of course, swans can be black. And they were so surprised by this that this is where that term black swan comes from. Of course, the real story isn't quite as exciting as that, but that's why we call those risks, which are our unknown unknowns or our big surprises, black swans. Because, of course, they can be there, but we just didn't foresee them before they occurred. The final box that we have in this grid is that of our unacknowledged risks, or our elephants. And we call them elephants after the saying, the elephant in the room. And these are the risks that we often know are there, but for whatever reason, we're just not talking about them, we're not sharing them, we're not questioning them or challenging them. And they exist for a myriad of different reasons. It might be because we assume that somebody else is dealing with the risk itself. Or it might be that for whatever cultural or sensitivity reason, we don't really feel that we can raise that risk or share it with other people because it's just not the done thing. It might be because our own risk management process and system doesn't actually allow us to share some of those risks. And this comes to fruition, especially where we are very reliant on our impact against likelihood matrices or various impact criteria. Because what you find in organizations is that if people don't feel that their risk is important enough or doesn't trigger certain boxes higher up on that impact criteria, then there's no point in them sharing it because nobody cares. Of course, you miss all kinds of little baby elephants when you don't share this information. And so, of course, the final point that we have here is that can be very siloed in our thinking. So we only think about what's going on in our world round about us, rather than what could be the impact of our risk to somebody else, somewhere elsewhere within the organizations. And it's these elephants in the room, it's these elephants that are often actually where our emerging risks are sitting. And it's the risks that we're not necessarily talking about, but we often know about within our organization, and we should be sharing, because then once we've shared them, we can be doing something about them. So if I just take away what's in front of this picture here, yes, this is a picture from Western Australia. And despite the fact that the little girl in the picture is wearing a Superman pajama set, we all know what could happen if she gets too close to those swans. It would not be a surprise to us if one of those swans pecked her. So this, unless somebody intervenes or does something, this might be an elephant they're all sitting back and observing. So one of the big value points in risk management and also emerging risk management is to empower people to be able to point their fingers at those elephants and move them down into the acknowledged risk territory. Because once we've done that, there will also be fewer surprises for us as an organization, because we've been more transparent in our sharing of the information. And so therefore, as an entirety, we will be less surprised by risks that may emerge or may come to fruition in front of us. So most swans are actually elephants. And I'm sure many of us have been involved in highly scintillating debates over the last couple of months over whether COVID-19 is a black swan or an elephant. And I think most of us are in agreement that it is very much a big elephant. We all knew that there was the possibility of a global pandemic. Were we entirely ready for it? Were we sharing it to the degree that perhaps we should have shared our concerns? Perhaps not. And so that maybe puts the impetus back on us as risk managers to get better at communicating with one another, to make sure we have fewer big fat elephants sitting in the room round about us. And that, of course, takes us back into our risk management process again. So how do we get these elephants into our normal way of managing risk? And that is, of course, about the risk assessment. So being open and being welcoming to people suggesting those elephants in the room and being able to incorporate them into our prioritization of which are those big important risks, and not perhaps paying as much attention to what the likelihood of a risk might be. Because with emerging risks, it's incredibly difficult to say what the likelihood is. And so as a result, sometimes people put those risks off to one side, or they get downgraded artificially because we just don't have the data to support what the likelihood or the certainty of those risks could be. It also comes down to the fact that they can be incredibly difficult to control, or incredibly difficult to know what to do about them. So with this, how much can you and do you actually want to manage with regards to those risks? So if we go back to California and the potential for a very large earthquake to occur in California, this is something here where many of the buildings that have been built recently in that state are built to withstand a very large earthquake. They are not built, however, to be usable after that earthquake. So taking learnings from COVID, it's not just about the pandemic. It's also about all of those secondary impacts that we get with regards to doing things like lockdown. So for example, our economy. So if there is a very large earthquake in California, okay, people might survive, but actually the secondary impacts may be absolutely catastrophic because nobody will be able to go back into those buildings. Nobody will be able to use those hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a case there where from a risk appetite and tolerance level, the authorities in California currently are saying, okay, we feel that we can control whether the building is going to fall down, but we're not going to push that level of control to the degree to which we will say that this building will be usable after it is hit by a very large earthquake. So this is something here where we talk about what can't we control. So we can't stop an earthquake from happening. That's just not possible. But what can we control? And often things will be mandated by authority. So this then gives us, perhaps we are a building contractor or a designer, what do we actually want to comply with what the government is telling us to do? And then, of course, in between that, we have all kinds of additional options. So the decision is ours with regards to what we want to do. To use the example of COVID, okay, what can't we control? Well, currently, we really cannot control that virus that has spread around the world oh so quickly. What has been mandated? Well, until very recently within the UK, we were in lockdown, and with that came certain rules, and it was up to us as human beings whether we wanted to comply with that or not. Are there then additional controls that we could put in place? Well, yes, as you can see, these two gentlemen in the picture have chosen to wear masks. So that's been something that here in the UK, it has been up to us as individual people, whether we've wanted to wear masks or not. And we've been able to make that decision or that choice for ourselves. And so you see this different range or degrees or grades in what is the degree of control that you want to put in place with regards to these risks, despite the fact that there might be huge amounts of uncertainty associated with them. So just moving on to the next slide, this is a case here of our knowledge of our context is constantly changing. And so therefore we may constantly reevaluate what do we think are the right controls, or what do we think is the right degree of control that we should put in place. So what do we think is appropriate? And that will constantly change depending on the information we have to hand and what we know is going on in our internal and our external context. This graph here that I'm going to gently build up, I have kindly borrowed from Dr. Keith Smith from his consultancy Risk Covered. And Keith is one of the drafting members for the new ISO standard with regards to emerging risks. So this very much comes from the background thought that has been going into that standard. Now, what you can see here with this blue line is that when we start off at the beginning of our emerging risk, we don't really know very much about it at all. However, over time, either that risk keeps happening or different aspects of that risk keep occurring, or perhaps different risk indicators keep occurring. So we begin to collect more information about it, and we begin to understand what is this risk to a much greater degree. For those organisations that differentiate between emerging risks and risks, as we go through time, that risk is transgressing from emerging risk into our risk factor as a whole. Also, what will be happening during that, of course, is that the quality of the information we're receiving will probably increase. Right at the beginning of this risk emerging, quite a lot of the data that we're getting will probably not be very good. And if not used correctly, or if we don't know what the quality of that data is, then it may send us off on a wild goose chase. So we may not be able to make accurate predictions of what might happen in the future, purely because we're basing our risk-based models on inaccurate information coming into those models. Also, what happens is, of course, the risks begin to occur to a greater extent, but also our ability to manage the risk matures. And this might be because we're seeing lots of different strategies, lots of different attempts to manage the risk. These then build up and we'll begin to see strategies that show that they have actually worked beginning to come in place. And those can then be adopted by other countries, for example, around the world. It's only after a long period of time that we actually get the regulatory and the legal framework coming in. And I think you'd all agree that with regards to COVID, we're nowhere near any of that at the moment. So we're still probably somewhere over to the left-hand side of this graph with regards to COVID-19. There's still an awful lot of information that we've got yet to come to us and be able to assimilate and be able to use. So changing context, again, I'm sure that all of us remember a few months ago when the big thing on everybody's minds was that of loo paper. I think it started off primarily in Australia with them all stockpiling it and our shops running out. But then, of course, I think every country in the world went through those same emotions, those same approaches with regards to what was happening, with regards to this developing or perhaps this emerging risk that was COVID-19. So back all those months ago, what were we worried about? What was our priority from a personal perspective? Well, to start with, we were probably pretty worried that our families or our friends or even ourselves might get ill. Once we got through that, then there was the case of, oh, do I have enough supplies? If we go into lockdown, or perhaps if all of the shops shut, how am I going to eat? How am I going to stay alive? How am I going to get through all of this? Then perhaps it all became a little bit exciting. So especially when we first went into lockdown, this was actually quite new. It was novel. Perhaps there was an element of excitement. I'm trying to spin a nice wave on this, by the way. After that, of course, there was the psychological trauma that was coming through. So we went from excitement to, are we going mad? I think especially everybody who's been looking after their children, having to homeschool them, for example. This is a very new experience, especially if you're trying to juggle still carrying on with your work, working from home. So the psychological upset with regards to everything that was concerned with lockdown, what were the priorities? And every time we get something else layering on top of that initial priority, which was we might get ill, you almost get a weakening of that. And people beginning to say, well, actually, I have to be able to go outside. I need some fresh air, otherwise I'm going to go mad. And you see that balancing of pros and cons between different people to say, okay, how much risk am I willing to take with regards to getting ill versus my mental wellness? So how do I balance all of that? After that, of course, yes, we begin to think we should have bought shares in Zoom or other video conferencing platforms. But then, of course, we really begin to worry about money. Perhaps we've lost our jobs. The government's beginning to seriously look at the economy and think, okay, actually, there comes a tipping point in here where we're actually willing to sacrifice people's health to actually get the economy started again. And I think we're in one of those tipping points at this precise second in time. I'm sitting here in the middle of Westminster, and certainly as of yesterday, there were crowds of people walking through the streets with no masks on, no gloves on, no apparent awareness that COVID-19 has not disappeared. It's still very much there. But in terms of that balance or that shift in terms of behavior, almost as that concentration on getting the economy started again has really kicked in. So what does that say with regards to our priorities? Of course, that might lead to an ease in lockdown, and that's perhaps where we are at the moment. And then we have a whole wide array of different actions we might be able to take to be able to deal with those emerging risks. And how do we do that? It's by going through that risk management process again and say, okay, given this evolving context and given this new information we have with regards to this emerging risk, how much control do I actually want to take? And how do I do all of this? And this question here is all about risk appetite and risk tolerance. So risk appetite and tolerance, this can be applied to any risk all over the world. And basically what we say from our organizations is, okay, within our particular sector or within our country, we have a whole universe of different risks. There are some risks within that for which we have an appetite to take. So those are the risks that we are willing to take. Around the edge of our risk appetite, we have a zone of risk tolerance, and those are the risks that we can take. We don't necessarily want to take them, but we can take them. And around the edge of that, we have our risk capacity. And the risk capacity is that tipping point beyond which we really can't go. And if we go there, then we have to consider changing our strategy or accepting the fact that we may go bust as an organization. Now, the reason why the risk tolerance is offset is because, of course, there are some risks for which we have very little tolerance for. So those will be health and safety risks, bribery and corruption, for example. And there'll be other risks for which we have very much larger tolerance for. So things like the delay to a project, for example, will have a much larger tolerance for that. The problem with this comes that when you realize that a risk that you think you are managing to have a very low degree of tolerance is actually sitting outside your risk capacity. It's at this point here where you have two decisions or two choices. You can either pump time, money, and effort into actively managing that risk, so it now moves back into your tolerance level again. So that would be option one. Or you can change your tolerance level with regards to that risk and say, actually, we're okay for that risk occurring on a much greater level than we thought it might do originally. So you just sit back and you tolerate things to a much greater degree. And that is perhaps what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing a relaxing in the tolerance with regards to the health sides of COVID-19 to enable us to boost the economy in terms of what is going on here. So we're trying to balance those pros and cons with regards to what is happening from a risk appetite and tolerance perspective. And we see this flexing in tolerance the whole time when we talk about emerging risks. And we need to, because as that risk emerges, the certainty with regards to that risk becomes more and more clear. But to start with, we really don't know very much about it. So we're having just to put a line in the sand with regards to the degree of uncertainty. But just because that risk is emerging doesn't mean to say that we can't use risk appetite and tolerance in conjunction with it. Also, this allows us to begin to put together trigger action and response plans. And again, we've seen these being used across the world. And those trigger action and response plans generally pertain to that zone of tolerance and tell us, okay, are we in a nice green zone, or are we out there in the terrifying zone of actually things are going really wrong here? We need to pump in more time, money, effort to be able to manage these. And those trigger action response plans generally consists of metrics describing those levels, as well as actions that need to be taken should that level be hit. And they work really well, provided leadership have the guts to actually stick to those actions that you have you've prescribed for those different levels. Or if they decide that actually those are the wrong actions, given the new information that they've now got on their table, they have to justify why they're not sticking to those tarps or for those levels of action that you need to put in place. And these tarps are things that we have seen being breached all over the world. So, for example, we had one of our team members working on a mine site in the Democratic Republic of Congo a couple of months ago. The trigger action response plan with regards to evacuation from that particular mine site said that if it even begins to look like the border for the DRC is going to close, then you evacuate all of those non-essential personnel, which included our team member. Unfortunately, the leadership of that site did not stick to the TARP, and so therefore they did not enact the evacuation as and when they needed to. And so as a result, our team member got stuck in a very beautiful, but also quite a dangerous part of the world where you would not ordinarily want to get stuck if the borders have closed. So this had very little really to do with COVID-19 and everything to do with the broader context of this part of the world. So what did we do? We took the potential impact of risk on our objectives, and our objectives was to keep our team member safe and well and able to obviously continue doing his work if he could. And we compared that to action needed to try and deal with this particular situation. So note, we did not use likelihood. We used impact against how much action was required to deal with this situation. And what this allowed us to do was to take a risk for which we could do nothing about. So this might be COVID-19, and say, yes, this could have a big impact, but we can't do anything about it. And compare that to other risks where perhaps we could do something about it. So risk number 2 might be something along the lines of, okay, so the border's closed, but actually we can spend lots of money and we can speak to all of the embassies of the world and we can try and get him airlifted out of that particular operation. So we could do something about it. So this is the difference between what can you do and what can't you do something about. And when you start comparing impact to action needed, immediately you end up with an action plan or something that is much more tangible than comparing action against likelihood. And this is really, really useful, especially when you're dealing with risks that are evolving or emerging very, very quickly. What does this allow you to do? You can then move those post-it notes around as and when you've put those controls in place. Here you can see some of our actual workings. Those blue post-it notes are the actions that were linked to some of the green risks that we had there on our little map of our impact against action. What did this then lead to? Well, it led us to be able to map different scenarios against what might occur in this particular part of the world. For each of those scenarios, of course, you can put in place different management options. So which actions are actually going to give you the best bang for your buck? Do we want to buy him a car so he can drive south over the border to Zambia? Or actually, does that bring with it more risk? Are we better actually trying to influence the British Embassy to be able to put on a flight to get him out of that particular zone of the world? What is our best strategy? What is going to be most effective with regards to the management of a very, very volatile and emerging situation? And this allows you to eventually hopefully end up with success. So all of these pictures here on the slide show the journey of Eddie from the DRC all the way out to France, which is his home. So this time about 2 weeks ago, we managed to get him home. Yes, he was trapped effectively in the Congo for approximately 2 months longer than we would have liked. It took us 2 months for us to get him out of there, but we used these very tangible tools to be able to enact that and to be able to deal with lots of emerging risks, a very changeable context, in order to be able to manage that situation. So I have rushed through those last slides, and my sincere apologies, but you can certainly find more descriptions on how to use those tools in the slide deck should you choose to download it. So in summary, some leaving points. Emerging risks are just risks. They're not something that's big and scary. They are just risks, and many organizations already deal with them. They just accept that there's going to be more uncertainty in conjunction with that particular risk. In order to be able to manage those emerging risks, you need to be honest with yourself and others with regards to what can you do, what can't you do, and then what maybe do you want to do in the middle with regards to managing those risks. Often this comes down to how much money are you willing to spend or are you willing to lose in your effort to manage something that is incredibly uncertain. And that is all about risk appetite and tolerance. That's what we actually mean by risk appetite and tolerance. Number 3, be prepared to flex those plans, because often what you thought was the best plan of action, when the next piece of data comes in with regards to that emerging risk, you realize that you're wrong. And so you need to be able to change your plan of action very, very quickly, or acknowledge that the direction that you were going in is perhaps no longer the best direction that can give you the best outcome. And finally, stay nimble and open-minded, because it's through that you will be able to see to a much greater extent what's actually going on in that interconnected world of lots of different risks coming together. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I shall conclude there for now, because I see that there are lots of lovely questions that are coming in, and I'll take some of those. Holly, do you have any questions to get me started?
Yes, I do. So yeah, we have had a few questions come in, which we'll address in a moment. We'll take 5 minutes to deal with those. But to begin with, what do you do if you can't control anything to do with the risk? Can you still manage the emerging risk?
Yes, so this is something here where if you can't actually do anything to guide the uncertainty with regards to that risk, sometimes it can feel really, really difficult, because there's nothing more you want to do than to actually take some action. But sometimes it might be better actually just to monitor that situation and then be able to plan some different scenarios. So say, well, what if this develops? What if that develops? Where are our active controls that we can put in place to actively guide that uncertainty? But often with an emerging risk, you don't actually really know what to do right at the beginning, but you need to be planning different scenarios or different options for that. So it's a monitoring, but be ready to put in place those controls as and when the right time comes. Next one.
Okay. No worries. And one of the participants has asked a question similar to what I was going to ask, so we'll take that one now, from Paul. So how useful or not is the likelihood consequence heat mapping type approach when dealing with when dealing with complex and uncertain risks? Is there a better complementary way? And I noticed you used action versus impact in your review.
So I think this is something where there's a big debate going on in risk management, or there's always been a big debate in risk management about how useful is likelihood. Because likelihood is so subjective unless you're dealing with very specific risks where you've actually got lots of data where you can pinpoint, okay, yes, that's the level of likelihood. And when it comes to these risks that you'll have seen one of my earlier slides, the emerging risks are often in that high impact, low likelihood box, which some people just say, well, that's just too hard to deal with. And also because it's not in your top right hand corner, it's almost downgraded in terms of its importance. So for that, personally, I don't really like using impact against likelihood, because I think there are lots of ways in which it doesn't actually help you prioritize your risks in a true manner. So instead, what I find often works much better, as I skipped through very quickly on the slides, is still take your impact. And of course, there are lots of different ways of measuring that impact or that potential impact. And instead of putting that against, okay, what is the likelihood of this risk occurring, actually say, how much do we need to do about it? So how much action do I actually need to take? And what that immediately does is it separates out, okay, where do people need to actively be thinking, okay, I need to mobilize myself or my team to do something about this, versus, okay, we acknowledge that this risk is really big, but there's nothing we can do about it right now. So it means that you've still got the priority in that top right-hand corner, which we're always programmed to do, but you don't have that never-ending debate around how likely is something. You don't have the gaming around likelihood where people are trying to make sure that their risk doesn't sit in a red zone and instead sneaks into that amber zone. And also it means that those emerging risks that even if they are unlikely to happen tomorrow, but they still might, okay? So this is the thing with the Californian earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. That could happen tomorrow, or it might happen in 100 years. We have no idea. There are no geological warning signals to tell us when that earthquake is going to occur. So putting likelihood on it and artificially pushing it down to the bottom of that axis is actually really dangerous and quite naive. So instead, get rid of that likelihood and use something more useful on that axis, such as, okay, how much action do we need to take? Or what is the level of effectiveness of the controls that we currently have in place? So putting something like that on your other axis can actually drive the behavior that you need, because you want people to be taking action or to be acknowledging the magnitude of that potential risk, rather than just sitting back and saying, oh, well, if it happens, it wasn't my fault. So hopefully, Paul, that addresses your question there.
I think that has. Okay, we've just got a little bit of time left for a few more questions. So the first one is, my interactions with senior leaders and boards over many years makes me think that they like simple and certain answers. Complexity worries them and they often prefer to ignore it. How can we engage them, especially in sectors unused to evaluating risks, such as education, in adopting this thinking?
Yeah, so giving people, that nice clear-cut answer is the difficult one, because often, actually, the answer that we need to give people is, well, it could be this or it could be that. I mean, I'm a geologist, and we're renowned for being dreadful, because we'll say, okay, so this rock that I have here, yes, ladies and gentlemen, I do have a rock on my desk, and someone says, well, what is it, or how much copper is in it? And I will usually say, well, it could be this or it could be that. So I'm giving people a range. Of course, people want a single number, especially accountants, because accountants want to put that single number into their financial modelling and get on with it. So this is something here where actually the real world is complicated. The real world does deal with ranges. And when someone says, how bad could this be? Well, I think there is an element here of saying, well, it could be very bad in that from an education standpoint, we might not be able to go back into schools properly until, let's call it September. Or on the other hand, we may be able to fix things so that we can go back now. What are the controls that need to be put in place to enable one of those options or the other option? And actually, by laying those two situations out in front of people, which is saying, okay, if you want children and teachers to be in schools in a safe environment, then you have to be prepared to put these controls in place to keep them safe. If you're prepared to do that, then great, go ahead. If you're not prepared to spend that time, money, effort, then actually you can't go anywhere near those schools. And instead, you need to be thinking about putting all of that learning online. It's often there, I think. So rather than saying, is a risk big and scary or not? I think it's actually flip that conversation around and say, how much effort might be needed for the controls? And are you willing to put those controls in place? That can actually be a much more honest and useful discussion perhaps to be had. Now, Nigel, I'm not sure that I've answered your question in all its glory, but I'm sure we can take that offline later. But it is exactly as you're saying, it is something where we need to have that dynamic thinking that's going on there. But also as well, we need to keep the conversation as simple as possible, yet embracing the complexity of the situation.
And we'll just take the final two, if that's okay. I know we're running over slightly, but the first one is around how organisations, I guess, identify the emerging risks which are relevant to them. And then the final question is around, how do you think organisational risk management strategies will be adapted or overhauled post-COVID-19?
Yes, so I think so the first question was around identifying emerging risks. So what do we think are the emerging risks for an organisation? And actually right now, when everybody's talking about what could the new normal be, that's an emerging risk conversation. Because, of course, the new normal is going to be full of potential opportunities and potential threats, which are, of course, just risks. And we need to be able to identify them and say, okay, which are the ones that we maybe want to take advantage of and which are the ones that we might want to stop? Because right now is a beautiful opportunity to pivot our organizations to take advantage of what we think the new world might look like. And with that, for example, you're seeing a lot of, say, lobbying of the government to say, okay, when we do properly start up again, let's do things in a climate sensitive manner or in a more sustainable nature, because we're actually at that tipping point. So you can see people saying, okay, there might be some opportunities on the table that weren't there 3 months ago. Let's take advantage of those. All of those potential opportunities or threats, those are emerging risks. So all of those big strategic discussions, those are basically emerging discussions. And the best way perhaps to think, okay, how can you identify some of those for your organization is to say, okay, what do we think the world is going to look like? And perhaps have three different scenarios and say, okay, what do we think our objectives are within that world? What do we actually want to achieve? Having done that, you can then work around those 4 steps of the risk management process. And that will help you to identify some of those emerging risks, work out which are the ones that you can manage or you might want to manage, and then go back up to your objectives again. And so that will help you not only identify your emerging risks, but also solidify what you think your strategy should be going into the future, where you can actually take advantage of COVID-19 rather than just having to survive it as an organization. And then I think that the second question that you asked was around how do we think that risk management may evolve as a result of COVID-19? Well, to be really out there as a risk manager, I hope that we get rid of impact against likelihood as a prioritization tool, or as the main prioritization tool, because I think it's artificially downgraded things like global pandemic. So it almost allows us not to have them as one of our top 5 risks on our risk register or something like that. I think likelihood is a massive problem for us as risk managers, and there are a whole myriad of other tools that we can use to help us prioritize our risks. Secondly, I don't think that for the last X number of years, the primary thing in risk management has actually been the risk assessment. But doing a risk assessment is just doing risk. It's not doing any management at all. And actually the value in risk management is the management bit, where we enable, encourage and steer people round about us to put in place the right controls. And so that's something there, whereas risk managers, if we can get closer to that management bit rather than the risk assessment bit, so get more into the management and the controls bit, as an organization or as a discipline, we will be much more valuable to the organizations in which we sit. And the final bit, the third bit, and I think we've seen this all over the world, our risk managers have become absolutely vital in those crisis management teams or those resilience teams that have been put in place very quickly by a lot of organizations who, whilst they had them on a piece of paper, had never actually used any of that stuff in the past. And through that, if those risk managers have done a good job, then actually in terms of their importance and their seniority within organizations, that should have been elevated up. Because actually what we're doing as risk managers goes hand in hand with strategy for the organization, especially when we're trying to navigate an ever-changing world. That is just management of dynamic risk, or dynamic management of risk, depending on which way you want to put the words in there. So on balance, and perhaps this is because I'm an optimist rather than a pessimist, COVID-19 has actually done risk management a massive favor in terms of allowing us to show the world what we can offer it, and also being able to give us the platform through which we can make sure that our organizations are truly resilient and can take advantage of any opportunities for the future.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences with us today, and thank you also to everyone who has joined. We hope you found it useful. Right, that's enough for today. So enjoy the rest of your days, and goodbye.
Thank you.